Jake had always considered himself a man of simple pleasures. A good cup of coffee, the roar of his police motorcycle, and the sweet satisfaction of catching speedsters who thought 90 miles per hour was a suggestion rather than a limit. But nothing prepared him for the absurdity he encountered the day he moved into Oakwood Estates, a neighborhood that could only be described as a gated community with delusions of grandeur. It wasn't long before Jake realized that Oakwood Estates wasn't governed by laws or common sense. It was ruled by the HOA, a shadowy cabal of suburban tyrants whose power was rivaled only by their pettiness. One fateful evening, after wrapping up a grueling shift patrolling the highways, Jake returned home to find his prized police motorcycle reduced to a smoldering heap in his driveway. The acrid smell of burnt rubber filled the air, and scattered around the wreckage were bits of what used to be his helmet, a casualty of what could only be described as vehicular arson. Taped to his mailbox was a note written in Comic Sans, because apparently even criminals have bad taste asterisk, join the HOA or face the consequences. Asterisk. Jake stared at the note, then at his bike, and then back at the note. Consequences? He muttered to himself. What is this? A mafia movie set in suburbia? You see, Jake had refused to join the HOA when he moved in 3 months ago. It wasn't out of rebellion or principle. He simply didn't see the point in paying $300 per month for rules like no lawn flamingos and mandatory beige paint on all fences. Plus, as someone who spent most of his time enforcing actual laws, he couldn't stomach the idea of being bossed around by Karen, the HOA president whose personality was equal parts clipboard and condescension. Karen had made it clear from day one that non-members were considered undesirables. She even referred to Jake's motorcycle as a disruptive eyesore during their first interaction. Jake had laughed it off at the time. Little did he know she'd escalate from passive-aggressive emails to outright pyromania. Standing over the charred remains of his beloved bike, Jake felt something stir deep within him, a mix of rage and disbelief wrapped in a blanket of dark humor. All right, he said aloud to no one in particular. If Karen wants war, she's going to get it. The next morning, Jake decided to confront Karen directly. He marched over to her house, a McMansion with an oversized fountain that looked like it belonged outside Caesar's palace, and rang the doorbell. Karen opened the door wearing her signature power suit and an expression that screamed asterisk. I'm better than you. Asterisk. Before Jake could say anything, she smirked and said, Ah, Officer Daniels, what brings you here? Finally ready to join us? Jake held up the scorched remnants of his motorcycle helmet like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. Did you do this? He asked bluntly. Karen feigned innocence with all the grace of a soap opera villain. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. But perhaps if you were part of our community, incidents like this wouldn't happen. Jake narrowed his eyes. You mean incidents like arson? Karen shrugged. Arson is such a strong word. At that moment, Jake realized two things. One, Karen was clearly guilty. And two, she wasn't going to admit it anytime soon. So instead of arguing further, he decided to play dumb for now. Over the next few weeks, Jake began digging into Oakwood Estates' HOA operations with all the precision and determination of someone investigating organized crime. He discovered that Karen had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for years, using fines and fees to fund extravagant parties while bullying anyone who dared challenge her authority. The more he uncovered, the more ridiculous it became. Secret meetings held at her house, complete with catered sushi, surveillance cameras installed without residents' consent to catch people who didn't mow their lawns, and even rumors that she'd once banned Halloween decorations because they were too tacky. But what really set Jake off was finding out how Karen had weaponized HOA rules against him specifically. Apparently, there was an emergency meeting after he moved in where Karen declared motorcycles a threat to neighborhood harmony. She even circulated a petition demanding their removal, signed exclusively by her inner circle of HOA loyalists. Fueled by righteous indignation and caffeine, lots of caffeine, Jake decided it was time for payback. Not just for himself, but for every poor soul who'd ever been victimized by Karen's reign of terror. He started small, parking his police cruiser directly in front of Karen's house every night just to annoy her. mowing his lawn into patterns that spelled out passive-aggressive messages like HOA equals tyranny, and blasting country music from his garage during HOA meetings. But these petty acts weren't enough, not yet. Jake wanted something bigger, something unforgettable. One evening, while sipping coffee and brainstorming revenge ideas, because revenge planning requires proper hydration, Jake remembered an old colleague who specialized in forensic accounting, a skill set perfect for uncovering financial misdeeds. After pulling some strings and making a few calls, he convinced his friend to audit Oakwood Estates' HOA finances under the guise of routine oversight. The results were glorious. Embezzlement disguised as administrative costs, fraudulent invoices for landscaping services that didn't exist, and thousands spent on Karen's personal expenses, including that ridiculous fountain outside her house. Armed with evidence and an unshakable sense of justice and humor, Jake presented his findings at the next HOA meeting, a spectacle attended by nearly every resident curious about what drama might unfold. Karen tried to dismiss him as a troublemaker but quickly lost control when Jake projected photos of her sushi parties onto a screen labeled asterisk, where your HOA fees go. Asterisk. The room erupted into laughter mixed with outrage as residents demanded explanations. By the end of the meeting, Karen's empire had crumbled faster than her ability to fake sincerity under pressure. She resigned in disgrace while muttering something about moving to Florida, a fitting exile for someone so obsessed with controlling others. As for Jake, he walked out feeling victorious, not just because he'd avenged his motorcycle, but because he'd reminded everyone that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes it comes from cleverness, and maybe just a little bit of revenge-fueled satire. Jake had always thought he'd seen it all during his years as a state trooper: high-speed chases, bizarre excuses from drunk drivers, and even the occasional criminal who tried to bribe him with coupons for free donuts. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the sheer absurdity of dealing with Karen and her HOA henchmen. If suburban warfare were an Olympic sport, Oakwood Estates would have taken home the gold. And Karen? She'd be the Michael Phelps of passive-aggressive tyranny. After exposing Karen's sushi-fueled embezzlement at the HOA meeting, Jake wasn't naive enough to think the battle was over. Sure, she'd resigned in disgrace, but Karen was like a cockroach. You could stomp on her reputation all you wanted, but she'd always find a way to scuttle back into the spotlight. Within days of her resignation, Jake started noticing subtle signs that Karen was still pulling strings behind the scenes. HOA newsletters began mysteriously appearing in mailboxes again, filled with thinly veiled threats about non-compliance. Lawn inspections resumed with a vengeance, and Jake even overheard whispers about a new, anonymous advisory board. Anonymous? Please. Everyone knew Karen couldn't resist slapping her name on anything remotely authoritarian. Jake decided it was time to dig deeper into the HOA's operations. Not because he particularly cared about lawn flamingos or beige fences, but because he hated bullies. And Karen? She was the queen bee of bullies, buzzing around Oakwood Estates with her clipboard and her smug superiority like she owned the place. So Jake did what any self-respecting revenge seeker would do. He started asking questions. The first thing Jake learned was that Karen had been running the HOA like a cult leader. Membership wasn't just encouraged, it was practically mandatory. New residents were bombarded with welcome packets that looked more like legal contracts than community guidelines. Inside were rules so specific they bordered on insanity. Trash bins must be placed exactly 6 inches from the curb. Holiday decorations are permitted only between December 1st and December 26th. No vehicles may be parked within view of neighboring properties unless they are beige or gray. Beige cars? Who even owns a beige car? Jake also discovered that Karen had a knack for weaponizing fines. Missed mowing your lawn by 1 day? That's $50. Left your recycling bin out overnight? Another $75. And heaven forbid you park your motorcycle in your own driveway. That was apparently grounds for arson. But what really made Jake's blood boil was learning how Karen had targeted him from day one. According to several neighbors, who spoke in hushed tones like they were spilling state secrets, Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting the day Jake moved in. She declared motorcycles a threat to neighborhood harmony and circulated a petition demanding their removal. The petition had exactly 5 signatures, all from Karen's inner circle of HOA loyalists who seemed less like concerned citizens and more like suburban minions. Fueled by righteous indignation and an unhealthy amount of caffeine, Jake decided to take matters into his own hands. He started by attending every HOA meeting, not as a member, because he refused to pay those ridiculous fees, but as a concerned resident who had zero tolerance for nonsense. And let's just say his presence didn't go unnoticed. At his first meeting, Jake walked in wearing his police uniform. Not because he needed it, but because he knew it would make Karen squirm. Sure enough, she avoided eye contact like he was Medusa and she didn't want to turn to stone. The meeting agenda included riveting topics like approved mulch colors and the dangers of bird feeders. But Jake wasn't there for gardening tips. He was there for answers. When it came time for public comments, Jake stood up and addressed the room with all the authority of someone who'd spent years interrogating suspects. "I have a question," he began, holding up a copy of the HOA bylaws like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. "Can someone explain why motorcycles are considered a threat to neighborhood harmony?" Karen cleared her throat and tried to look composed, but her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Well," she said, choosing her words carefully, "motorcycles are loud, disruptive, and frankly, they don't align with the aesthetic values of Oakwood Estates." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Aesthetic values? Are we talking about motorcycles or modern art?" The room chuckled nervously, but Karen wasn't amused. "This isn't a joke," she snapped. "We take our community standards very seriously." Jake smirked. "Clearly not seriously enough to follow state law," he said, flipping through the bylaws until he found what he was looking for. A clause about vehicle restrictions that directly contradicted local traffic regulations. Karen turned redder than a stop sign but said nothing. Over the next few weeks, Jake became a one-man wrecking ball against HOA hypocrisy. He started showing up at meetings armed with legal documents proving that half their rules were unenforceable under state law. He filed complaints with local authorities about their unauthorized surveillance cameras, which were conveniently pointed at his driveway. And when Karen tried to fine him for leaving his trash bin out overnight, Jake responded by leaving it out every night, just to make a point. But Jake didn't stop there. He decided it was time to rally the troops, or rather, his neighbors, against Karen's reign of terror. He went door-to-door sharing stories about her sushi parties funded by HOA fees and her ridiculous vendetta against motorcycles. To his surprise and delight, most residents were just as fed up as he was. They'd simply been too intimidated by Karen to speak out. Within weeks, Oakwood Estates transformed from a quiet suburban enclave into something resembling an uprising against tyranny. Residents started openly defying HOA rules. Lawns went unmowed. Trash bins stayed out for days. One brave soul even painted their fence bright pink just to spite Karen's beige obsession. It was glorious chaos, and Jake loved every second of it. Karen tried desperately to regain control, sending out increasingly frantic emails warning residents about the dangers of non-compliance. But her threats fell on deaf ears, especially after Jake shared copies of her fraudulent invoices with anyone who cared to look. By the end of month 2, Karen's hold on Oakwood Estates had crumbled faster than her reputation at sushi restaurants across town. And Jake? Well, let's just say he wasn't done yet. Jake had always believed in the idea that justice was best served cold, preferably with a side of irony. And as he watched Karen's empire crumble under the weight of her own absurdity, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. But if Karen thought she could retreat quietly into the shadows, she was sorely mistaken. Jake wasn't just here to dismantle her HOA dictatorship. He was here to make sure she never forgot the name Jake Daniels. The first sign that Karen wasn't going down without a fight came in the form of a new HOA newsletter, which Jake found taped to his mailbox one morning. It was printed on glossy paper, because apparently HOA propaganda needed to be fancy, and titled *Restoring Order, a call to action. The letter was filled with Karen-esque rhetoric about community values and the dangers of unregulated behavior. But the real kicker was the thinly veiled jab at Jake himself. Certain individuals have chosen to undermine our efforts, creating chaos and discord. We must stand united against these threats. Jake read the newsletter twice just to make sure he wasn't imagining things, then burst out laughing. Chaos and discord? He muttered to himself. Karen, I'm not leading a rebellion. I'm just mowing my lawn in zigzags. But Karen's newsletter wasn't just empty words. It marked the beginning of her attempt to claw her way back into power. Over the next few weeks, Jake noticed a series of increasingly bizarre initiatives popping up around Oakwood Estates. First, there were the new lawn signs that read asterisk, support your HOA. Together we thrive. Asterisk, then came the mysterious anonymous surveys asking residents whether they felt safe in their neighborhood. Spoiler alert, everyone knew Karen wrote them. And finally, there was the surprise appearance of Karen herself at one of Jake's favorite coffee shops, where she loudly proclaimed that Oakwood Estates was under siege by lawless individuals. Jake couldn't decide whether to be annoyed or impressed by Karen's persistence. On one hand, she was clearly delusional. On the other hand, her antics were so ridiculous they bordered on entertaining. But as amusing as it all was, Jake knew he couldn't let his guard down. Not when Karen was clearly gearing up for round 2. One evening, as Jake sat on his porch sipping coffee and brainstorming his next move, he noticed something strange. A group of people gathered outside Karen's house. They were holding clipboards and wearing matching polo shirts like some kind of suburban SWAT team. Jake squinted at them through his binoculars, because yes, he owned binoculars, don't judge, and realized they were conducting what appeared to be inspections. It didn't take long for Jake to figure out what was happening. Karen had assembled her loyalists into an unofficial HOA task force. Their mission? To patrol the neighborhood and enforce rules that no longer officially existed. It was peak Karen behavior, like trying to run a country after being impeached. Jake decided it was time for some good old-fashioned reconnaissance. He grabbed his phone and started recording as Karen's task force marched from house to house, measuring lawn heights and peering into trash bins like they were searching for contraband. At one point, they even stopped at Mrs. Peterson's house, a sweet old lady who'd lived in Oakwood Estates for decades, and accused her of violating aesthetic standards because her flower beds weren't symmetrical. By the end of the night, Jake had enough footage to make a documentary titled asterisk, Karen's Revenge, The Rise of Suburban Fascism. Asterisk, but instead of submitting it to Netflix, tempting though it was, he decided to share it with his neighbors, because nothing brought people together like laughing at Karen's ridiculousness. The next day, Jake sent out an email blast with links to his video and a message that read, asterisk, attention Oakwood Estates residents. If you've ever wondered what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked ego, look no further. Asterisk, within hours, his inbox was flooded with responses ranging from, "This is hilarious," to, "How do we stop her?" And that's when Jake had an idea, a brilliantly petty idea that would turn Karen's own tactics against her. Using his connections as a state trooper and a little creativity, Jake drafted an official-looking letter addressed to Karen and signed by the Department of Community Oversight. The letter stated that her unauthorized task force was in violation of multiple local ordinances and that she could face fines if she didn't disband it immediately. To add an extra layer of authenticity, Jake printed the letter on official-looking stationery and delivered it via certified mail. When Karen received the letter, she went ballistic, at least according to Mrs. Peterson, who overheard her ranting about government overreach from across the street. But whether she believed the letter was real or not didn't matter. What mattered was that she stopped her patrols almost immediately. With Karen temporarily neutralized, Jake turned his attention back to the residents of Oakwood Estates. He knew that if they wanted lasting change, they'd need more than just laughs, they'd need organization. So he started hosting weekly community forums in his garage, which conveniently doubled as his motorcycle workshop. The forums were informal but effective. Neighbors shared their grievances, brainstormed solutions, and even voted on new rules that actually made sense. By week 3, Oakwood Estates had transformed from a neighborhood ruled by fear into one ruled by common sense. And maybe a little bit of sarcasm, thanks to Jake. Lawns were still mowed, mostly. Trash bins were still taken out, eventually. But gone were the days of beige fences and clipboard inspections. As for Karen, she retreated into her McMansion like a defeated dictator writing her memoirs. Occasionally, She'd send out cryptic emails warning residents about the dangers of complacency. But no one paid much attention, not when they were too busy enjoying their newfound freedom. And Jake? Well, let's just say he wasn't done yet. Jake had always believed that revenge was an art form, and Karen's downfall was shaping up to be his masterpiece. Sure, he'd managed to neutralize her clipboard-wielding suburban militia, but he knew better than to underestimate her ability to stage a comeback. Karen was like a bad rash. Just when you thought you'd gotten rid of her, she'd find a way to irritate you all over again. And Jake? He wasn't about to let that happen. One afternoon, while Jake was tinkering with his motorcycle in the garage, because revenge planning pairs perfectly with carburetor maintenance, he overheard two neighbors talking outside. Apparently, Karen had been spotted meeting with a lawyer at the local coffee shop, the same lawyer who'd helped her draft the original HOA bylaws. Jake paused mid-wrench and smirked. "Oh, Karen," he muttered. "You're really going for round two, aren't you?" Jake decided it was time to escalate his efforts. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he'd show her just how messy things could get. Armed with his trusty laptop and a bottomless cup of coffee, Jake began researching HOA regulations, local ordinances, and, most importantly, Karen's personal history. What he discovered was nothing short of glorious. Karen had a long track record of questionable behavior, including multiple complaints filed against her by former neighbors in other communities. One particularly juicy detail: she'd once tried to ban outdoor grilling because she claimed the smell of barbecue offended her sensibilities. Jake couldn't resist sharing this tidbit at the next community forum. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, holding up a printout of Karen's complaint history like it was a winning lottery ticket. "I present to you Exhibit A, proof that Karen has been terrorizing neighborhoods long before she graced us with her presence." The room erupted into laughter and applause as residents swapped stories about their own run-ins with Karen's absurdity. But Jake wasn't just here for laughs, he was here for justice. And justice, as it turned out, required a bit of creativity. Using his newfound knowledge of HOA bylaws and local laws, Jake drafted a proposal to officially dissolve Oakwood Estates HOA. The plan was simple: gather enough signatures from residents to force a vote, then watch as Karen's empire crumbled once and for all. Of course, Karen wasn't about to let this happen without a fight. When she caught wind of Jake's plan, she launched an all-out propaganda campaign to sway residents back to her side. Flyers began appearing on doorsteps with slogans like *Save our community, *, Don't let chaos win, Karen even hosted a unity barbecue in her backyard. A hilariously ironic move for someone who hated the smell of grilling. Jake decided to crash the barbecue. Not because he wanted free food, though the ribs did look tempting, but because he wanted to see Karen squirm. He arrived wearing his police uniform because why not? And immediately became the center of attention. Karen tried to act cordial, but her forced smile looked more like someone trying not to choke on bad sushi. "Officer Daniels," she said through gritted teeth. "How lovely of you to join us." Jake smirked. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." As the evening wore on, Jake couldn't help but notice how desperate Karen had become. She mingled with guests like a politician on election day, shaking hands and making promises she clearly couldn't keep. At one point, she even tried to convince Mrs. Peterson, the sweet old lady whose flower beds she'd criticized, to support her campaign. Jake decided it was time for some fun. He approached Mrs. Peterson and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mrs. Peterson, did you know Karen once tried to ban grilling in another neighborhood?" Karen froze mid-sentence as Mrs. Peterson gasped in horror. "Ban grilling?" she exclaimed. "But I love my Sunday barbecues." Karen stammered something about misunderstandings, but the damage was done. By the end of the night, half the guests had turned against her, including Mrs. Peterson, who vowed never to trust anyone who didn't appreciate barbecue. With momentum on his side, Jake ramped up his efforts to dissolve the HOA. He organized door-to-door campaigns, hosted more community forums in his garage, complete with snacks, and even created a website where residents could sign the petition online. Within weeks, he'd gathered enough signatures to force a vote, and Karen knew it. On voting day, Oakwood Estates felt more like a battleground than a neighborhood. Residents lined up outside the community center clutching ballots like they were casting votes in a presidential election. Karen stood near the entrance wearing her signature power suit and handing out flyers that read asterisk, vote no. Protect our community. Asterisk. Meanwhile, Jake stood nearby wearing jeans and a t-shirt that read asterisk, vote yes. Freedom tastes better than beige fences. Asterisk. When the results were finally announced later that evening, it wasn't even close. 82% voted in favor of dissolving the HOA. Karen stormed out of the community center muttering something about ungrateful peasants, while Jake celebrated with his neighbors over pizza and beer in his garage. And just like that, Oakwood Estates became what it always should have been. A neighborhood governed by common sense instead of Karen's clipboard dictatorship. As Jake sat back and watched his neighbors laugh and bond over slices of pepperoni pizza, and yes, someone even brought barbecue ribs, he couldn't help but feel proud. Not just because he'd won the battle against Karen, but because he'd reminded everyone that sometimes justice isn't served cold. It's served with extra cheese. Karen might have lost this war, but Jake? He'd gained something far more valuable. A community united by laughter, and maybe just a little bit of revenge-fueled camaraderie. Jake woke up the morning after the HOA vote feeling like a man who had just won the lottery. Except instead of money, he'd won freedom from Karen's clipboard dictatorship. The air smelled sweeter, the birds sang louder, and his coffee tasted like victory. For the first time in months, Oakwood Estates felt like a neighborhood instead of a suburban Hunger Games arena. Jake stretched, smiled, and muttered to himself, no more beige fences, no more lawn inspections, no more Karen. It was going to be a good day. But as Jake stepped outside to admire his newly liberated driveway, he noticed something strange. Karen's McMansion was unusually quiet. Gone were the oversized fountain's obnoxious gurgles and the faint sound of her barking orders at landscapers. In fact, her house looked almost abandoned. Jake squinted at her front yard and noticed a for sale sign planted firmly in the grass. He chuckled to himself. Well, looks like Karen couldn't handle defeat. As word spread about Karen's impending departure, Oakwood Estates erupted into celebration. Neighbors threw impromptu block parties, kids decorated their bikes with streamers, and someone even set off fireworks. Though Jake suspected that might have been illegal. Mrs. Peterson baked her famous apple pie and delivered it to Jake's doorstep with a handwritten note that read, asterisk, thank you for saving us from tyranny. Asterisk. Jake accepted it graciously, though he couldn't help but laugh at how dramatic everyone had become. Despite the festivities, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done causing trouble. After all, she wasn't the type to go quietly into the night, or in this case, into escrow. So when he spotted her lurking near his mailbox one afternoon, he decided to confront her. Karen, he called out as he approached her. What brings you to my humble driveway? Karen turned around slowly, clutching what looked like another HOA newsletter. She was wearing her signature power suit, because apparently defeat didn't warrant casual wear, and sporting an expression somewhere between smugness and desperation. Officer Daniels, she said with a forced smile, I just wanted to personally thank you for your contributions to our community. Jake raised an eyebrow. Contributions? You mean dismantling your empire? Karen laughed nervously but didn't respond directly. Instead, she handed him the newsletter and said, I thought you might find this interesting. Jake unfolded the paper and scanned its contents. It was titled A Farewell Message from Karen and filled with flowery language about how she'd dedicated herself to improving Oakwood Estates and was now moving on to pursue new opportunities. But buried at the bottom in small print was a line that made Jake choke on his coffee. Asterisk, I will be establishing a new HOA in my future neighborhood to continue my mission of fostering community excellence. Asterisk. Jake stared at her in disbelief. You're starting another HOA? Karen nodded proudly. Of course, Oakwood Estates may not have appreciated my vision, but there are other neighborhoods out there that will. Jake couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. On one hand, Karen leaving was a blessing. On the other hand, she was about to inflict her clipboard tyranny on unsuspecting strangers. He shook his head and said sarcastically, well, I wish those poor souls luck. Karen smirked and replied cryptically, "You'll see." And with that ominous remark, she strutted back to her car, a beige SUV, naturally, and drove off into the sunset. Over the next few weeks, life in Oakwood Estates returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after months of suburban warfare. Without Karen's interference, neighbors began forming genuine connections instead of passive-aggressive rivalries over lawn care. The community forums in Jake's garage evolved into weekly hangouts where residents shared stories, laughed about Karen's antics, and occasionally debated whether pink fences were better than purple ones. Jake found himself enjoying the newfound camaraderie more than he expected. As much as he loved his motorcycle and his coffee-fueled solo adventures, there was something satisfying about being part of a neighborhood that actually felt like, well, a neighborhood. But just when Jake thought he'd seen the last of Karen's influence, he received an unexpected phone call from his old colleague in law enforcement, the forensic accountant who'd helped him uncover Karen's financial misdeeds. "Jake," his colleague said with barely contained excitement, "you're not going to believe this." "What is it?" Jake asked cautiously. "I did some digging on Karen's new HOA plans," his colleague explained. "Turns out she's already filed paperwork for it. And get this, she named it Karen's Community Excellence Initiative." Jake burst out laughing. "She named it after herself?" "Of course she did." "That's not all," his colleague continued. "She listed herself as president and treasurer, and based on her financial projections, she's planning to charge even higher fees than she did at Oakwood Estates." Jake shook his head incredulously. "Unbelievable." His colleague chuckled and added, "I thought you might want to know, just in case you feel like warning her future neighbors." Jake considered this for a moment before replying with a grin. "Oh, I'll warn them all right." And so began Jake's final act of revenge, a campaign to expose Karen's antics before she could unleash them on another unsuspecting neighborhood. Armed with his trusty laptop and an arsenal of embarrassing footage from Oakwood Estates, including clips of Karen scolding Mrs. Peterson about flower beds, Jake created a website titled The Truth About Karen. It featured everything from testimonials by former neighbors to detailed accounts of her sushi parties funded by HOA fees. Within days of launching the site, it went viral, not just within Oakwood Estates but across neighboring communities as well. People shared it on social media with captions like "Beware of this HOA dictator," and "Don't let Karen ruin your neighborhood." Even local news outlets picked up the story, turning Karen into an unwitting celebrity for all the wrong reasons. As for Karen, well, let's just say her plans for world domination hit a major roadblock when prospective residents started Googling her name and promptly decided they'd rather live anywhere else. And Jake? He sat back with a cup of coffee in one hand and his motorcycle keys in the other, feeling like justice had been served once again. So if you've ever dealt with an overbearing HOA or had your lawn flamingos banned by someone who thinks they're Napoleon of suburbia, remember this: there's always hope for revenge, especially if you have Wi-Fi. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like this story if you enjoyed it, share it with anyone who loves a good laugh at suburban drama gone wrong, comment below with your own HOA horror stories, and subscribe for more tales of justice served cold, or sometimes extra crispy.